Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to this week's episode of the Refold Roundtable podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things language learning. And today we are doing a deep dive into dialects. I'm here with George, aka Gorg, and our special guest Ian from Korean Patch on YouTube. You've probably already seen his channel if you're a Korean learner, but his channel is all about learning Korean authentically with comprehensible input and cultural knowledge. He also helped create the Refold 1K vocabulary deck, and we're really excited to have you here. Thanks for joining us. Um,
Thank you
Jo-
very much.
yes. Do you mind doing a quick introduction of yourself, even though I just did?
Sure. So hi everyone. Hello, Refold Community and Refold Podcast Community. My name's Ian. I'm an American from Chicago, but I live in sunny Busan, South Korea. I have been living here for about 6 years. I started learning Korean after living here for about 1 year, out of frustration and other things, and took me about 2 years to get to a conversationally fluent level of Korean. Had kind of an unconventional learning experience and ended up finding Refold just on my journey to find the others. So now I, teach Korean or teach things about Korean online and promote the Korean language and Korean culture to people who might be interested in it. And I love what I do. And I'm very happy to be here
We're
with the
really
homies.
excited. We're
And
we're really
Ian,
excited to have you here.
you have something coming up, but is it a secret? Are we allowed to talk about it or not?
No, it's not a secret at all. Yeah, I've been working on a
Okay.
project for about a year. About a year ago, I did a beta test for two different projects that I'm working on, and one of them is almost ready. It's a book and a video course, and there will also be a live aspect to it for people who are really interested in the project. Don't have all the details on that yet because I'm still finishing the book, but it's a project on 경상도 사투리, which is the southeastern dialect of Korean. That's a dialect of Korean that I speak. That's a dialect of Korean that a large percentage of Korean people speak. And there's almost no material about how to learn it or how to understand it out there. So I put together an English language, conversational, easy to read resource that will teach you all the details about how to understand this dialect when you run into it. So you can really appreciate more of the Korean language in the way that a native speaker does.
All right. That sounds great. And now y'all know why we have Ian paired with the topic of dialects, because he is a Southeastern Korean, a Busanese master. Now let's get into it. So, what exactly is a dialect, y'all? Like, let's try and define it.
Do we need to draw a line in the sand of like what a dialect is?
So I'll take this one. So a dialect is
Okay.
poorly defined. Linguists don't actually agree on what is or isn't a dialect. There's a bit of a meme that in Europe they call two different dialects different languages. And if you ask two different people in say China, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, that language I totally don't understand. That is a dialect, right?" And that's a bit of a joke. But basically, dialects are poorly defined. Linguists actually avoid the term. They use terms like
Mhm.
variety or dialect. But we'll be defining dialect as a variety of a language that's like kind of mutually intelligible, um, but it's got differences in grammar, right? So, like, I'm from Kentucky, I'm from the South, y'all. I say things like, you might ought to go to the store, or I might could do that for you. And that sounds really ungrammatical to people like Ian from Chicago, where they don't
Mhm.
stack modal verbs. So, differences in pronunciation, grammar, dialect, still kind of the same language. We're not going to get into it, I guess, but that's how we'll be defining dialect here. So we're not saying like, oh, the a variety of Chinese spoken in Korea or something is going to be a dialect. No, we're not going to be doing that here, not on this podcast.
Okay. You heard it. Don't even
And then
try in the
within
comments.
dialects, you've
Don't
got
even try
different
it.
types of varieties, right? You've got like sociolects, like how rich people or poor people talk. You've got
Right.
regional varieties, all sorts of things. So that's how we're defining dialect for this podcast. Now, yeah, so where does it start? Dialects are actually pretty controversial, believe it or not. One thing that comes up a lot on the podcast that I hammer down is don't ignore other dialects. A lot of learners ignore dialects that are not their target variety. I personally don't think you have to do that until later on. But what do you guys think?
Did you do
Well,
that
I mean,
even when you learned your when you learned your dialect or no?
so I had, like I said, I had kind of an what is that word?
What
Unconventional
even is
learning
it?
experience. It's my dialect, y'all.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
in in Korean, I moved straight to Busan, this city down in the south, the second largest city in Korea. Um, and I've lived here the entire time I've learned Korean. So this dialect is kind of normal for me. Like the way that people speak, the pronunciation changes, grammar changes, whatever, is pretty normal for me when it comes to Korean. I think that like quote standard unquote Korean, I'm not really into that word, but a lot of people use it and the government uses it,
Mm.
is kind of exotic to me in a lot of ways. Like it's harder to understand, I think. It doesn't like, hit quite as hard for me, let's just say. Even though
Yeah.
most media is created in that format. So I didn't really learn Korean from media so much. I actually got most of my comprehensible input. There we go, another one.
Love
Um,
it.
people. So I learned from people around me, coworkers and friends I had made and stuff like that. And so I got a lot of my comprehensible input through this lens of these people who speak a certain way. So it's kind of like an English learner like being dropped into like I I don't want to give too specific an example because I don't want to like add all that baggage to Korean, but maybe like someone who wants to learn English and they get like dropped out of an airplane with a parachute into like the middle of Mississippi. Like they're
Mm.
going to learn English in a quite different way than people might somewhere else.
Right. So
So yeah, when it comes to dialects, I think yeah, I heard another meme. You didn't say this one, but I wanted to say a dialect is a language with an army. Or a language is a dialect with an army
oh,
and border.
yeah. Yeah.
That's like I thought you were gonna say that meme a minute ago.
That's a good one. I feel that. So when
So
you started learning, you said that you learned the dialect that you learned. How do you say dialect, by the way, in Korean? So like what
So that's a great question because in all of the East Asian language, like East Asian cultural sphere, countries
yeah.
that historically used Middle Chinese characters to write their language, there is a better word for this that they use. They use the word
Pangyan.
방언. Yeah, 방yan and whatever in other languages. In Korean, it's 방언, 방언. And however, there's also a native Korean word for this that's not a loan word. It's called 사투리. Saturi. Saturi
And
is the
that's the
word they
word that you
use.
used at the start of the podcast, right? When you
Exactly.
were
Yeah. There
introducing.
isn't.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah. There's not a great word in English. I think we don't quite have the infrastructure for that in the English language. Variety is
right.
probably the best thing, but even that's a loan word. So
Yeah.
I think
I mean, we could
Fangyan
say
is like
kind of
something
same
like literally
accent.
like location speech. I think if you look at
exactly.
the Chinese characters for it. Former
Yeah.
washed out Mandarin learner here. So
Something I talk about in the course too, in the project is kind of this idea that like the language any language is kind of like this gradation across a region where like there are people in the middle of two dialect zones that kind of use a little bit of both of them, and there are people in who are like in exclaves that use certain dialects and don't interact with other people, and like geography is involved in all of it and all that kind of stuff. And so the like what is a dialect and what is a language, to get back to what we were talking about a minute ago,
Yeah.
is that's one of the other reasons it's really hard to to pin down, and why these other words kind of help a little bit. Saturi, or I don't remember what it is in Chinese, Pangon in Korean, are
Fangyan.
there you go. They're
Ignore
helpful.
my pronunciation. It's very anglicized.
That's cool.
It's headcanon now. That's what it is. It doesn't matter what it really is.
Yeah, and to
Fossilized.
touch on that, what Ian's talking about here is what sort of can happen is you imagine you have a spectrum, right? and you've got like 5
Mhm.
villages or 6 villages. Someone from village A, someone from village 1 and someone from village 6 might not understand each other, but someone from village 3 might understand both perfectly, right? And sometimes
Yeah.
what happens is that for some reason, villages 2 through 5, they might have language shift where they suddenly village 2, 3 are speaking the variety of village 1, right? And
Mhm.
village 5 moves over even closer to village 6, and then like that sort of continuum can be lost. And that's happening like right now in like France, and it's happened all over. Like it's happened in China, it's happened in a lot of places. And that's sort of like where if that continuum breaks, then you have a really hard split. Like, okay, I don't understand that anymore. Like it's not possible. And that can happen. And it's a very complex issue, I think, probably beyond the scope of this podcast.
Yeah, I don't think we're gonna solve it right here.
So, what are your thoughts as someone who was dropped in to like Busan and you were very like intimately familiar with it? Because one thing that I rail on about is like don't neglect other varieties because you see this a lot of the times. Like I'll give you a stereotypical English as a second language example. I used to teach for the Japanese version of the Hagwon, right? I used to teach for an
Mhm.
Eikaiwa, an English conversation school. And a lot of students would not expose themselves to South Asian English, people from India or Bangladesh,
Mhm.
people, or even from Southeast Asia, Singapore. And then they would say, I don't understand my Indian coworkers. And I'm like, well, you've got Indian coworkers. You're going to have to expose yourself to that variety because it's a really common trend in Japan. They only want to hear either received pronunciation, like BBC, or they want to hear somebody who's very general American, like CNN type English.
Mhm.
And what I have seen over 5 years of teaching at an Eikaiwa was that if you don't expose yourself to as wide a variety of possible of the language as you can, you will not understand it, right? Like you yourself mentioned, like you don't listen to that much standard Korean, and you sometimes it doesn't hit right, you know.
Mhm.
So, what
Yeah,
are
I
your
mean, it doesn't
thoughts on that?
feel. Yeah, so I think that a language is all of the language all of the time. That's kinda how I like to think about it. Um, the reason I think that, like, the dialect, for example, that I talk about in Korean, the 사투리 that I talk about in Korean is so important, is the for Americans, I think, or for any English speaker or English learner even, I think a good, analogy for it would be like not learning, AAE or African American English. It's not called AAVE anymore, I learned that recently, but, like the
Yeah,
black dialect, the black, version of American English with, like, all of its unique grammar forms, pronunciation differences, vocabulary changes, etcetera. You know, look how prevalent that is in American media, on the street in America. Yet the percentage of people that speak this dialect in Korea is even higher than the percentage of people that use AAE in the US. So just imagine like learning English and never, ever, ever, ever learning how like a large percentage of the population speaks. Like it's hard to even imagine not being able to understand that. So I think that a lot of people logic themselves into this idea that like, oh, I don't want to like corrupt my speech. Or I even saw someone make a joke about this on YouTube where they said something in English and changed their dialect every couple of words to talk about like how they to make an argument for why you shouldn't like confuse yourself with other dialects. And I think that that's so like so reductive and incorrect, because just hearing something once or many times is not gonna change the way that you like speak, you know what I mean? That doesn't really happen for us either. Over a long period of time, things happen, but like in general, what you acquire is what you keep, you know? And when you learn something new that's related, or when you start to acquire something new that's related, it doesn't corrupt. It adds to what you already, have taken in. So I think you should be exposing yourself to, like you said, as much as you can all the time because it strengthens your understanding of the standard as well, in my opinion. It doesn't give you an accent or anything like that.
Yeah, I would agree. You have to intentionally acquire it. A good example of this might be Bree. So Bree is a
Yeah.
Spanish learner, and she is supposedly learning Mexican Spanish because
Supposedly,
obviously,
allegedly.
that's
Yeah.
that's the variety that's most spoken in the U.S. It just makes sense, right?
Right.
And Mexico is the biggest
Mhm.
Spanish-speaking country, like natively. So again,
Yeah.
it's essentially the USA of
Mhm.
Spanish, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and have you acquired that Spanish lisp at all? Because I know that despite
No.
allegedly being a Mexican Spanish learner, you really vibe with Spain content.
I really do vibe with Spain content, and I've never limited myself to just one dialect. I follow my interests, good or bad. That's how I live my life. And I read what I like and I watch what I like. And no, I didn't acquire the CH list. I can understand it easily. Um, I like it because it makes dictionary lookups a lot easier because I know how things are spelled. If it's a
Mhm.
CE, a Z, or an S or whatnot, the Spain accent makes that a lot easier for lookups. But I don't feel like I have a hard time confusing in my head. Like there's a lot of like Mexicanisms that I still don't know, but I don't have a hard time going, "Oh, this is a phrase from Spain," or "Oh, this is a phrase from Mexico." I don't really mix them up in my head that much. So, a lot of times beginners will come to me in the Spanish server and they're like, "Oh, is this resource European Spanish or is it Latin American Spanish? I really want to learn X." And my reply is, "It doesn't matter in the beginning because there's just so much overlap that you're not going to the differences won't matter until much later, in my opinion." So,
Until assuming you're following the refold plan of like not outputting until stage 3.
yeah.
I agree. That's when you should narrow your focus and focus on a dialect.
Yeah, I mean, even then, I still don't think that you should restrict the things that you watch. I mean, maybe try to focus on increasing the amount of a certain dialect in your immersion habits or whatnot, but um I don't know, I just don't really see an issue. If you're watching it all, if you're comfortable with it all, I think that can only really help you.
A lot of the stuff I talk about too with regard to language learning is about trying to avoid like learning a language aesthetically and like actually becoming a speaker of the language like
I
culturally
love
and
that.
in an identity way.
Yeah.
And so I don't think I think it's kind of disingenuous for a lot of people to be like, "Okay, I wanna speak this language with this dialect."
Yeah.
It's like, well, are you gonna just be doing, like, a good imitation of people that speak the language with that dialect? Are you doing a like, is this a bit? Like, these
It's
things come out naturally, you know,
right.
over time. If you're not gonna do what I did and come and live with these people and learn the language in this way,
Yeah.
like, it's kinda just an imitation, and you don't have to worry about it. I don't mean that as, like, a way to I don't mean to, like, belittle people or insult them. I do mean, like, chill, y'all. Like, it's not a big deal, and you can pick these things up later, but, you don't find a lot of people that speak a second language to a high level with any kind of specific regional accent unless they lived there for a long time. If we're
That's
learning a
true.
language through media, you're going to pick up a standard-ish version of the language with a little bit of seasoning from your native language that you speak and whatever maybe dialect that you're interested in or the language parent that you reverse adopt
A
or
good
whatever.
example of this would be the partner, your partner who has helped you with Korean, right?
Mhm,
She did the voice for the Korean 1K, and it's standard Korean, but it's flavored with a little bit of Busan, right?
mhm, yeah, yeah,
A good example is one of the first words it teaches is the word for person. And if you listen to there's a little bit of a difference in how the vowel quality is between how she says like saram and another person would. She doesn't seem to have quite as long of a first vowel in that word. But it's still standard Korean, right? It's just flavored, right? Just sort of like I'm from the South. So for example, we have Ben, right? He does the
mhm,
marketing for us and he helps,
You
He's
mean
one of the Refold
Ben?
coaches.
No.
And I say BIN, but it's
Right.
BEN, Ben. But I'm still
Right.
speaking basically standard English right now. It's just flavored.
That's kind of what's going on in Korea as well. Like I don't I'm sure there's a word for it, but the dividing line for a lot of dialects at this point is regional, but it's more of an age thing. It's kind of like Americans in a lot
Oh,
of ways with English, where even within our regional dialects, people who are in their like 20s and 30s and under, because of our like nationalized mass media culture, a lot
yes.
of our dialects have gotten kind of pushed down a little bit. They're less strong. They're a lot more mutually intelligible. Like even in Chicago, our unique the accent that we have, like the unique Chicago dialect, is pushed down a lot because like our media comes from California, and our actors come from, you know, Australia and pretending to be American, or like,
Right? Yes.
or like New Yorkers or whatever. Our politicians are from the South,
Keith Urban
and so you
moment.
hear, yeah, it's like you
You
hear
guys know he's
you
Australian, right? He's a country singer. He sings, but he's
No, is
actually
he?
not. He is. Google it. He is
I am Googling
Australian.
this right now. You'll have to excuse me
Google
for a
it.
second. Oh my
Google
gosh.
it. He's not American.
Australia.
What does
Mel
Google say,
Gibson
Brie?
isn't even from okay, Keith Urban.
Keith Urban.
Oh my
Keith,
gosh.
Keith Urban.
I mean, I don't listen to him, but like I've heard the name,
Well,
you
yeah, well,
know?
we're from the South. Like, you go to like the dollar store in the
Like
South, and like
you're
there's
gonna
gonna be
hear the
country music
name.
playing.
Oh
You
my
can't
gosh.
avoid it.
That's so funny.
Yeah, he is
That's funny.
Australian.
I'm in shock right now. Good for him. Singing country music in the US.
So, I have a question. What is the state of dialects in like y'all's target language? So, for example, you mentioned sort of that like it's an age thing, right, Ian, in Korea, where like older people tend to speak the standard less, or they speak a heavier version of the
Yeah.
traditional dialect. But how are dialects like perceived in Korea, for example?
Mm,
Ooh. Okay. There's a lot to this, so I'm gonna try to make it simple so I don't talk for like an hour.
I'm
Um,
into it.
in in general, the dialects are first divided by region, and the region pretty much corresponds to the political boundaries of different, like, I guess, provinces. They use the word do in Korean for this, but different provinces within the country. And so that would mean there are one, two, three, four, five, six different dialect groups in the country in general. Now, of course, within each region, they are further divided, and they can hear what city each other are from, et cetera, et cetera. But my classification of dialects as a practitioner and not just someone sitting around like talking about theory with illegible research papers, I think that there are really like three and a half dialect groups in Korea and not six. Um, there's the standard Korean, which is based on Seoul, and most of the country speaks like a flavored version of that. There's this huge mountain range that cuts the country like in thirds, kind of. And on the east side of that, where I live, we speak like a totally different kind of Korean that's like has much less intelligibility with standard Korean. And then there's Jeju Island, which is an island south of the peninsula, and they speak something that most linguists call a different language. Now that's almost gone now. It's not super highly spoken, but that's kind of its own thing as well. So the state of dialects within that framework of there being kind of like standard, flavored standard, Busan style. I'm just gonna call it Busan style for people who are, you know, not learning Korean. And then the Jeju language. Then there's an age component to the whole thing. So older people speak a much stronger version of the dialect, much less intelligible with with each other for a variety of reasons. Uh, and then like people move around a lot too. Like a lot of people want to move up to Seoul to work, and because of that, I think that the perception of dialects in Korea. No, I don't think that. I know that the perception of dialects in Korea is that people in Seoul look down on people who have dialects, who have any kind of variation to their speech, as something that they need to, quote, fix. That's the word people use. When people from Busan move up to Seoul to work, because all the large companies are in Seoul, all the famous universities are in Seoul. When they go up there to work, they receive what they call discrimination. A lot of people really don't like it because they get superiors at work, 선배 or whatever, senpai for all you people who know Japanese. They get told to fix their accent. I don't like it. I don't like listening to it. I can't understand you, or it makes me uncomfortable, or it just sounds wrong, unprofessional. I think that's horrible. It really bothers me that people do that. But I think
That
that's such
happens in America too, by the way. You
Yeah,
yeah,
it
know,
totally.
you mentioned AAE earlier, and
Absolutely.
that's one dialect along with mine as a sub. Well, like we could further subdivide, but Southern American English is stereotyped, right? As like rednecks and white trash, and
Mhm.
AAE is also very heavily stigmatized. So, what
yeah.
happens in America is usually people who are like um, speakers of a non-standard variety. They have to end up being bidialectal. They kind of code switch
Yeah.
between different varieties, something more like General American when they're at work, and then when they're with their friends or their family, something closer to like how they would speak organically.
Yes. And that is also something that's really common here. Um, and I think that's one because of schools and media, I think that's one thing that is um, diluting the dialect in a lot of ways, diluting the saturi, is the fact that they're expected to speak with this sort of standardized Korean. Um, However, the one region that, like, has been unable to really start speaking standardized Korean, more like Seoul style Korean, is Busan. And so that's why I they're the one region that they always get caught whenever they move anywhere. Everyone else
Ah,
there's kind of a joke in Korean, like, people from most regions move to Seoul and start speaking Seoul, but people from Busan never do. They're never able to do it. They always have a really thick accent. One of the reasons for this that might be kind of interesting for people is that Busan Korean or Gyeongsangdo Korean is is almost tonal. It's a pitch accent system, and so the intonation is totally different for like everything than standard Korean, and they hear that, and it's really interesting to them. It's like it's like if someone spoke like a tonal version of English, you'd be like, Excuse me, what?"
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
so
trying
I
to
think
imagine
that's
that right now, actually.
it's
That's
tough. I mean, in a way, right, if you look at, like, British English and American
yeah,
English, the
yeah,
intonation is quite different, and so it stands out when you sometimes you run into American English at least I have,
yeah.
American English speakers, North American English speakers, sorry, Canadians, um, who who speak with sort of British intonation, and it sticks out, and sometimes
Mm.
I've noticed, like, people react to it in a certain way of being, like, kind of I'm not sure what the word is, like, offended? They're like, "Why are you talking like that?" And I think that that kinda happens with Korean as well, when people try to standardize from this region, so
Have you run into
but that's
any
kind of the
issues
general state.
yourself speaking the Busan dialect?
I'm sorry,
Or
what'd you say?
have you run into any issues like that yourself, like the discrimination or anything? Or are you fairly insulated from that as a foreigner and living, I guess, in that area?
I don't yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna, like, claim any
Right? No, no, but you know what I mean, like,
no.
any, like,
Yeah,
weird looks or,
I
like, "Why
think
are you speaking
I
like
think
yeah,
that?"
foreigners are usually outside of that sort of thing,
Right.
right.
because there's
I
sort of
will
like a
say
reverse prestige, right? The
I
fact that
could
Ian
see it,
even
though,
speaks
being
Korean.
sure, I could see it be shocking, though, like, not only is he speaking Korean, but he's speaking this dialect that isn't the Seoul dialect
Yeah,
that I
it's a
guess
weird
most people
thing
are
where
trying to learn.
foreigners, particularly in very mono ethnic countries, are kind of without they're outside of the traditional
like, social
structure.
hierarchy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very complicated situation, as a
Mm.
person who's lived in Asia for many, many years, and
Yeah.
I can see there being problems and issues and discrimination, but it's not going to be because he speaks Busanese, I don't think.
Sure, I think
It's going to be
discrimination was the wrong word, but, like, any, like, raised eyebrows or
Yes.
anything of that nature.
To answer your question, yes. Like, to give you a simple answer,
Yeah.
hopefully everyone that's listening can understand the nuance of what we're talking about, so I'm not, like,
Yes.
claiming any any,
No, no,
like,
no, 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 no,
any
no.
too much here, but yeah, not from people down here, though, right? It's not like people from Busan are like, "Why are you talking like that, bro?"
Because it's just
Um,
normal
for
to
them,
them.
they like
Yeah.
it, and I think that that's been one of the reasons I've been able to be successful with learning Korean when so many people struggle with it, is because I found kind of a way in to feeling like part of the in group. I don't really feel
Mm,
like an outsider so much when I'm with other people from Busan. Like, I had this interesting experience, and I'll answer your question in a second, but I had this interesting experience where, like, I went to dinner with my girlfriend. I talked about this
yeah.
on YouTube too. My girlfriend and, 2 and and her friend's boyfriend, so there's 4 of us. And me and my girlfriend and her friend are all speakers of this dialect, but her boyfriend is from the other girl's boyfriend is from Seoul, and they live up in Seoul. And they came to visit us, and while we were all talking at dinner, he was like, "I can't understand you guys. What are you talking about?" And I realized at that point, like, I was in an in group that another Korean person was not while
Ooh,
speaking Korean. Like, he was the foreigner in that moment. And
wow.
so, I think that this was really, like, psychologically beneficial to me because it kind of put me into an in group. So, with Korean, I don't think people it's not like English where, like, if I was, like, speaking with, like, a fake or, like, a not authentic Southern accent, people would be like, "Why are you doing that?" Um, it's not, like, offensive or anything.
Mhm.
However, people who are from Seoul have often commented when they are speaking with me, like, "Wow, you why you talk like you're from Busan? Why you do that?
Ah, okay.
What's going on there?" And so I'm like I was kind of surprised by that. I was, like, kinda taken aback that somebody would go out of their way. Like, you understood what I'm saying.
Right,
Why would you
right,
say that?
right, okay,
So,
interesting.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I haven't, like, lost a job or, like,
Yeah, of
lost a
course. Yeah, no.
friendship,
Yeah, I
but,
feel like the way I phrased my original question was, like, super dramatic, but, like, really, it's like you are getting, like, questions like, "Oh, that's odd.
But
Why are
for
you speaking that
Korean
way?"
people, it is that
Yeah,
dramatic. So your question is, like, not
yeah,
it is that, like, that bad. Your question is not a
yeah,
bad question at all. I'm just not I am not Korean to people I
right,
don't know.
right.
Now to people I do know, I am in the in group, like I said. I feel like I've developed sufficiently, like, a sufficient identity to be included in the social hierarchy with people I know and their network. But, like, with total strangers, they see me and they have no idea I even speak Korean until I've talked to them for a while because
Interesting.
I'm white, so they're they know. They know I'm not from Korea. They can
Surprise
see.
Pikachu face. Yeah. Gasp.
Mhm. It's always like that.
That's really interesting. So, would you
Yeah.
recommend to someone how would you recommend then someone, like, learning a dialect naturally and not putting on an
You knew my
act
answer
like
to
you
that
would
question,
say?
didn't you? Yes, I would recommend.
Yeah.
Um, how would I recommend learning a dialect naturally? Well, you are not even for, like, other languages, like European languages and stuff like that, that have, like, colonial, um, varieties on other continents, etcetera, Spanish, French, well, English even, you're not gonna always find, like, clean, um, pure, uncorrupted study materials or grammar books or anything like that, that will, like, give you an introduction to these concepts without the quote standard being the base. It's pretty hard to find stuff like that. I mean, look how hard it is to even find, like, Taiwanese Mandarin materials that have English as a base. It's not super easy to find stuff like that. There's not a wide variety. Almost everything's based on, like, continental Mandarin. Um, so my recommendation for people is to learn the dialect, like, consciously study the dialect with a basis of like with the base of what you're studying in the dialect being the quote standard version of the language that you'll find in any other kind of study material or any kind of, you know, like reference material you'll find online. All the rest of the details are things you can learn in the language later on, or you'll pick up when you go live in that area or whatever. But um, I think the like basing what you learn about the dialect not on your native language, but based on the target language is going to help you both solidify your understanding of the standard stuff that you're learning from, looking up grammar or asking people questions or whatever online, and the dialect itself. I think that's a much better way to go about like learning about the dialect. Acquiring it is similarly difficult because like it's hard to find media that's only in the one dialect completely, you know? It's not easy for almost any language. I mean, I guess for English, maybe you can find stuff that's, like, only American, North
Yeah.
American, but even then, like, people are from different regions, so you're
I
gonna
don't think
you're not.
that's a good comparison, comparing, like,
Really?
North American, sort of general American English to, like, Busanese. It would be like, imagine you're moving to, say, Western Pennsylvania or Eastern Kentucky in the Appalachian Mountains, um, versus something approaching, quote unquote standard, right? Like,
Mhm,
media English. And I think there are workarounds for, like, again, not national varieties, but like you can search YouTube and hit keywords for like places in that region. You can use dialect words that are probably going to trip a response. I
mhm.
put together a Southern Tagalog dialect playlist for Refold, and I was able to find quite a few channels, enough to get people started learning Southern Tagalog, which is like probably the most distinct variety of the language. And my method for doing that was, again, just searching what I knew to be dialectal terms um, and regions, and kind of filtering through. It takes work for sure, like hunting remotely, like remotely hunting media in a variety, but you can do it. And that's one of my hacks for it, is definitely using dialect specific words, and definitely searching like regional places, like not a big touristy place, right? Like think of the Busan area, right? There's going to be
Mhm.
tiny little exurbs and stuff that like are not going to be famous outside of the Busan area. And if you type it in, you're going to get people from there, like posting. And it's sort of my hack. It's not perfect. It's still difficult, but I think you can. I think you can definitely. There are ways to expose yourself to regional varieties on like YouTube.
Yeah, I think for me, yeah, I agree with you. For me, though, for Korean, I found that a lot of people code switch when they start speaking in a, like a register of Korean that they're doing a presentation, if that makes sense. Like they're like speaking to a crowd, which is what making a YouTube video is, or a vlog or anything. And you get a much less regional version of their speech. So what I think is best for people to do when it comes to interest in any kind of specific regional variety of any language is to make themselves aware of the features of that dialect or that variety. See, we're just gonna keep switching words here. Make themselves aware of how it works,
Yeah.
learn the rules, whatever, learn what the markers are and the differences are, and then look for those people in media you're already enjoying. That's what
Oh,
I've
that's
done
good
with the
advice.
dialect. That's what I've done with the Busan dialect because you'll find a character that speaks this way, one or two, in like almost every piece of media. Tons of celebrities speak this way, and if you look for like saturi online, most of what you're gonna find is saturi content, things dialectical content through the lens of someone who speaks standard Korean and thinking, "Oh wow, that's interesting. Oh, that's weird. Oh, that's strange." And it's kinda like wanting to learn, like, how Texans talk and just Googling Texas English and seeing, "Down in Texas, we say howdy, y'all," and that's, like, all you get. "Howdy, y'all," and and like three other like grammar things, and then like it's every single piece of content is just about those few things.
Yeah.
That's really frustrating for Korean, at least, because most of the content is the same like 5 words that Seoul people actually know from this dialect, or ones that have like leaked into standard Korean from down here. Because some of that has happened, is like it's cool, and so it's leaked into the standard speech as well. Um, so I think making
Sort of
yourself
like
aware of the dialect and kind of
that, sort
finding
of
it in
like
other
a
media is more
comparison
helpful.
there would be like how Fidna has expanded from the South and from AAE to like cool people English, right? And y'all is also
Absolutely.
expanding. You've got people
Y'all's a
from
great word.
Canada, people from California using y'all because it sounds a little
Mhm.
bit more, I guess, like gender neutral, I think, than you guys, which used to be the more common thing. Um,
Yeah.
and sometimes, there's definitely no language or variety is in a bubble, right? So
No.
as Busanese influences Standard Korean is going to influence Busanese, right? And to
Yeah.
clarify, when I mentioned looking for like dialectal terms, don't search the word blah 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 dialect or blah blah blah
Mhm.
pung'un or whatever, because you're going to get those videos where it's like not the content that you're looking for, but the actual
Right.
terms that are used, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, totally. If you're and it yeah, and if you're able to, like, find someone you enjoy that just makes content you're interested in, and they just happen to be a speaker of the dialect you're interested in, and that influences their speech, you're gonna notice a lot of stuff about how they're different and get a lot of natural input from that person, so that's very helpful. I think it's like with this dialect too, with the Busan variety of Korean, there are lots of YouTubers who speak this dialect, and like I said, they're really unable to shake, like, the accent a lot of the time, and or hide it because of the intonation differences and things like that. And you'll find a lot of people who are making, content in, like, professional quality Korean, but they have this kind of flavor to it, and you'll realize quickly that, like, oh, all of the content that this person shows up in is going to be dialect content for me. And so I've found quite a few people like that I've enjoyed, and I've followed their careers on YouTube or on TV even, because I like the way that they speak. They sound like my neighbors. So I like that a lot. Able to find them in more places.
So, what is the status, since we're talking about Pusanese so much? What is the status of the variety in media? So, a common example here on Refold, because everybody's a weeb, right? They're really into Japanese Kansai Ben
Mhm.
stuff. So the big sort of the Pusanese of Japanese would be the Kansai variety, right? Spoken in like Osaka, Kyoto,
Yeah.
and my understanding is that it's very common in dubs. So like if they're dubbing like a Texan in Japanese, they might choose somebody with an Osakan variety of Japanese, or like apparently comedy is often done in the variety. And like the ancient Greeks did this too. The ancient Greeks would like write poetry in one variety and speak in another and write rhetoric in another, and so on and so forth. Does that exist in Korea? Is there ever like sort of like a genre or situations where you can expect to hear non-standard varieties of Korean?
Yeah. So I'll just stick to the Busan variety because that's what I know best. But you'll hear the Busan variety in a few different ways. So in one will be the like gangsters, criminals. It's funny that you mention Kansai actually because there's a lot of memes online. It's not like linguistically accurate, I guess, but how the Busan dialect and the Kansai dialect of Japanese are like uncannily similar in their intonation, pronunciation changes from the standard. A lot of people who don't speak either think they sound the same. Um, there's like people are like confused by it a lot of the time, and the cultural significance of it as well is quite similar. So I would say you'll hear the Busan dialect when there's criminal characters like gangsters, which is kind of offensive, but it is what it is. And you'll hear the Busan dialect with like older people and country people. That's generally where you're gonna run into it because they want to exoticize those kinds of characters a lot of the time, and they really wanna, like, really differentiate them from the other characters, and this is the most different kind of Korean that's still more or less mutually intelligible, unlike Jeju. Like, Jeju is, like, a different language, and there's only, like, 30 or 40,000 people that still speak that, so it's kind of not prevalent in media, but when it comes to people who speak Peninsular Korean, you're going to hear, like, different I'm putting that in air quotes, you can't see my hands, but different people will speak with this Busan dialect because it's stark like, it has a very stark difference from the standard Korean. But that's generally how you'll find it. It's kind of similar with Kansai, although comedy is not really done in, the Busan dialect so much.
It is used sort of as a narrative tool. Like it's an instant way to other the person, right? In the eyes of Koreans,
True.
right?
However,
Because
I
it's
will
like
say
it creates that contrast.
something that's kind of frustrating about Korean media, though, at least to me, and maybe I'm incorrect here, but I've consumed quite a bit of Korean media. When they dub characters for Korea, everyone, almost everyone, sounds the same. There's like 4 or 5 different voices that people use, and that's just it. There's like, you know, grungy old man that talks like this, or there's like 2 female voices, high and low female voice, and then, like, the attractive male voice that's, like, got that anime hero quality, and that's pretty much it. So you don't get, like, they don't, like, make Sandy on SpongeBob sound like she's got an interesting dialect or anything. That they don't do that. People just kinda speak in a standard I wonder if it's, like, the same, like, 5 voice actors doing everything sometimes, but,
It might be.
it
It
might be,
might
yeah.
be. Now I wanna
But,
watch
yeah, I don't
SpongeBob
run
to see
into a
what
lot
they do.
of yeah. I don't run into a lot of Busan dialect stuff, in dubbed material. Although I should. I wish.
Interesting. So the representation just isn't there even though it's such a widely spoken dialect. What do you think is keeping the Busan dialect existing? You said it's like the only one in Korea that's not
Yeah.
slowly fading away. What do you think is unique about it that's helping it resist the tides of time, if you will?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I don't know. I can guess, though. Um, one is just how different it is. I think that that helps retain it. So, for example, is gonna get a little bit technical, but I'll keep it as simple as I can.
Okay, I'm
Um,
here for it.
in standard Korean, they differentiate question types not by grammar or word order, but by just slight intonation differences. Okay. So, um, like, oh man, if you ask someone, like, did you do something? Like, did you do anything yesterday? Versus what did you do yesterday? Those are the same words in Korean. So you'll hear
Okay.
someone say, like, 너 뭐 했어? Or 너 뭐 했어? That's the difference. You don't have to speak Korean, but that's the difference for those two questions. One of them is a yes or no question, and the other one is an open-ended question where they want to know what.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
down here, though, there are specific grammar markers for separating types of questions. They end the sentence with a different particle. They'll say, for yes or no, they'll say "니 뭐 했나?" versus "니 뭐 했노?" They'll change it from "na" to "no," and like these things stick on the ends of words, and change a lot about how people talk. And so that stuff starts from a very young age, and I think it sticks. People think about expressing themselves in different ways down here.
Mm,
There are different rules for like when you need to mark sentences differently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the vocabulary that's different has died off. Like a lot of the Japanese words that were part of the language because of the brutal colonization of the peninsula, those are dying off in the younger generation. They don't
mhm.
use them quite as often, but in terms of, like, the grammar forms, those are alive and well, and the pronunciation, that's alive and well. as they
Interesting.
standardize. So I think that's one of the reasons is because it's more explicit than standard Korean. Because the geography thing isn't really a big deal anymore. People can travel from Busan to Seoul in like what, like 2 hours, 2.5 hours on high speed rail. They don't have to cross a mountain range anymore on foot.
Right,
So
right.
it's not it's not quite as difficult to get
It's
from one
also
part
like
of
the
the country to the
internet
other.
where people can talk to each other instantaneously all the time,
True.
regardless of life. Yeah.
But what's
Sometimes
interesting
dialect sticking around, it just comes down to speaker identity.
Mm,
If Busan is its own little cultural bubble, speakers may not feel the need to change as much. Uh,
yeah, I've thought about that too, but, like, Busan's weird. This region is kind of strange because while it's not a prestige, um, version of Korean, it's not, like, winning out, it used to be. It's kind of like a fossilized version of, like, Middle Korean, which like, in that time, this was at certain points of the Korean language's journey, this region kind of was like what was the standard version of Korean. So it kind of fossilized here at one point. And interestingly enough, lots of Korean kings and presidents are from here. Most of them are actually from this region. Most of the people who have been president of the Republic of Korea and lots of dynasties started from people that were from this region down here. So it's kind of interesting that this hasn't become the prestige dialect, given that most of the like leaders of the country are from here. But it's not like they have a super specific cultural identity either, because it's not like they're oppressed, right? Like they're usually in power. So that's why I say I don't know how the dialect has stayed, because there's not like a clear indicator.
there's something called covert prestige, where something kind of has prestige under the hood, right?
Mhm.
Um, and that's a really that's a really complicated concept. I don't think we're gonna have time because we're
no.
unfortunately nearing the end of our hour. But
Right.
covert prestige, let's Google it. Covert prestige in sociolinguistics is the type of scenario in which non-standard languages or dialects are regarded to be of high linguistic prestige by members of a speech community. This is in contrast to the typical case of linguistic prestige, where in only the standard varieties of a speech community are considered prestigious. So I think a good example of that might be like you mentioned, where you were with your girlfriend and her boyfriend, right? Her friend's boyfriend, and like
Mhm.
you were kind of in that in group, right? You had that covert Busan sort of street cred.
It's possible. There would be some interesting, psychology behind that. I'm not sure. That's an interesting concept though, for sure.
This would be a
And,
fun rabbit trail to go down.
yeah, yeah, I mean, I don't know, a couple of ways that the dialect manifests itself that might make it, like so there's okay, there's a lot of interesting research on this actually. I can't remember the name of the study now or the name of this field. It was some sort of like, oh, like linguistics based on perceptual dialectology, maybe is what it was called. They did this study where they had like people draw lines on a map of Korea, where people speak differently. And in general, there was like this line that separated out this region. And they had people, so like everywhere else it kind of matches what I said as my definition of the dialect groups, where the other dialects have kind of just become flavored standard Korean, and then this dialect is, like, really different. Uh, the then they had people, like, write down adjectives next to the region, like, "What do people from here speak like? What does it feel like to you?" And people from all different regions of Korea. And basically, everyone who's not from here said that this dialect was cool and tough and very masculine and very feminine and blah,
Oh.
blah, 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 blah. Lots of extreme responses.
Oh, wow.
And so that what the researchers concluded was that the exotic feeling that people get, other Korean speakers get from this dialect, kind of makes it interesting to them. It's kind of this like tempting other, that is still not acceptable to use in like professional situations. Like I said, people don't like, you know, they look down on it, I think, in standard Korean, but the the maybe that's where the covert prestige comes from, is this kind of quiet interest. This kind of, because people do write using this dialect online and in text messages where they're writing down spoken Korean, like in comments or whatever. It's not a written form. They'll write using the dialect and they'll write things phonetically as opposed to like spelling things, quote, correctly. So,
Oh.
yeah. So maybe that's where that covert prestige comes from. It's like a double super top secret covert prestige, but it is
That's
there,
yeah.
like, subconsciously for a lot of Korean speakers.
That's nuts. There's so this topic has been really interesting, and hearing your experiences, like, really going deep into the Busan dialect and how it's affected, um, the way that you've experienced Korea, and, like, the fact that you're so passionate about it that you're creating materials for other people to learn it as well, is I can really I've really felt your passion this podcast, and I wanna thank you for joining us. It was awesome speaking with you, and, um, I'm not learning Korean, but I found myself like, "Maybe I should." After listening to you talk about it, I'm like, "Maybe I should open up the Kara 1K again and give it another go."
Hey, hey,
Yeah.
let's
Um,
go.
but that about sums it up for this episode. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to this week's episode of the Refold Roundtable podcast. If you're tuning in for the live premiere, make sure to join us for the after party immediately after the podcast in the Refold Discord. If you like this episode and want to hear more, you can listen to past episodes on YouTube and Spotify and anywhere else you can listen to podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to give us a like and leave a comment to let us know. We love reading your comments. And if you want to suggest a comment for a future episode, we'd love to hear from you. You could suggest future topics in the Refold Discord, and all of those links will be listed in the description below this video on YouTube. And that's it for this week. We will see you again soon. Bye bye.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Refold Podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening and maybe even learned something new. Projects, events, and content like this podcast are only possible thanks to our generous patrons. If you liked this and want to see more similar projects, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Visit community.refold.la/patreon-benefits to learn more.